that, I'm pretty lucid. Well, that's kind of very disciplined. That's very disciplined. Especially if you're going
I think we're ready to get started. We have a great deal of wonderful information to deliver for you today, so I wanted to get going. I hope you've all seen, first of all, my name is Lucia Scholwer, and I'm the chairman of the Sundays at 2 committee, and I'll introduce the other members shortly. I hope you all saw the article in the Rap Record. We got great placement, and it prominently featured Gloria Wallace, who we wouldn't be here if it hadn't been for Gloria. I hope you also will check out the library's Facebook page. We have a wonderful rendition of that article in AI presentation. So it's a really fabulous thing. So please do check out the library's Facebook page. We just couldn't do all the things without Gloria. We have an awesome committee of 6 volunteers. We have Bud Ward over here on the left, and Sandy Chewy in the back, and Sheila Stepko over here, and Pat Tracy right here, and Ernie Monching.
Right here.
Right there. I'm looking right at Ernie. And then, of course, we have Robertson, who's our tech guru, making all the magic happen. And we couldn't do any of this without Alice Cooper, who is the ex officio member of our committee, but more prominently, the director of the library. So today is the first of 6 presentations for our 30th season of Sundays at 2. It's hard to believe that we've had 30 seasons now. So please take one of the flyers that's over here that reviews all of them, or you can take individual flyers that feature, focus on the individual speakers. Please complete the evaluation that Sheila gave to you when you came in. We need that feedback. It helps us define what speakers you, the community, want to hear from. So we're also welcoming those who are watching on Facebook Live today, thanks to Shelley making those arrangements. And you will also be able to watch this later through the library's YouTube channel. So it'll always be available to you. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Bud, who's going to introduce our speaker, Al Ross. Bud, over to you.
Thanks, Lucia. This is going to be the shortest introduction you've ever heard. It's certainly going to be the shortest introduction I've ever made. Before I make it, I just want to say we would appreciate your holding questions until the end of the session. It's going to be a short introduction for reasons that I'll explain at the end, but they'll obviously become obvious to you during the presentation itself because of the quality of the presentation, and we want to make sure there's time for the rest of it. So my introduction is as follows. I introduce Al Ross.
We're going to talk today, and I'll tell you, my goal here is in an hour from now, plus or minus, you leave here knowing some things that you might not have known otherwise, and you find it at least moderately entertaining and somewhat interesting. So what we're going to do is talk about 3 different things, and for, I guess, administrative ease, I've separated them into 3 separate subjects, but in reality, they are intertwined, interactive, and the narrative of wildfire policy, aircraft development, and firefighting operations all fit together, which I think you'll see how that works. So, but first a word about me, and this is the introduction that Bud was going to give you. I spent my first lifetime in the Navy, I can't tell from this picture whether I was coming or going, which is probably not a bad description of most of the time I spent. But I know that whatever I was doing, it was important because I had the sword on. I only wore the sword for important stuff. So I was an aviator, and the aircraft that I flew the most was the P-3 Orion, a Lockheed Electra derivative, long-range patrol and reconnaissance, anti-submarine, anti-surface ship warfare. And I tell you that because in about 40 minutes, that will become important. So, and we'll explain kind of the trajectory of my life, how I got from there to there. So what I would like to do is first give you a disclaimer, and that is that what we're going to talk about is 90% subjective, and it's my opinion. And you'll find out as we go along, I'm pretty opinionated. It's my opinion, and I don't represent any individual, company, agency, corporation, association, or anything else. What you're going to hear is my opinion. But my opinions were formed from almost 30 years in the industry. And it's unfortunate, but the relationship between the aerial firefighting industry and the government has largely been contentious and adversarial. Unfortunate, but that's the lens that I tend to view things through. And as Bud said, I'm happy to answer any questions you might have, but please hold them till the end, because I think you can tell from the subject matter that there's 1,000 different rabbit holes we could disappear down and never get to the end. So with that, humans have always had a kind of a love-hate thing with fire. And if you're up on your Greek mythology, you know that Prometheus, before he got the job at Rockefeller Center, was the Greek god of fire. And he defied Zeus and shared the secret of fire with humans, with mortals. And for that, his reward was he was chained to the side of a mountain, and every afternoon an eagle would swoop in and rip out his liver, which magically regenerated overnight, so we could repeat the process every day. But I just read a couple of weeks ago that the first evidence of controlled use of fire was over 400,000 years ago in a spot in England, which is pretty amazing to me because humans, Homo sapiens, us, didn't appear until about 300,000 years ago. So that's that Neanderthal DNA, I guess, but fire was, the love part of the fire thing was safety, obviously, keeping the lions and tigers and bears away from the mouth of the cave, as well as being able to survive through an ice age, but also controlled use of fire enabled the Iron Age, the Bronze Age, and ultimately the Industrial Age. But the hate part, periodically, large-scale destruction as a result of fire. Every major city in Europe and North America had its great fire of fill in the blank. London, 1666, Paris, 1729, Lisbon, 1752, Norfolk, our own Norfolk, Virginia, 1776. Although Lord Dunmore, the British governor, and the Royal Navy had something to do with that one. Chicago, 1871, and so on. But what we want to, the period of time I want to focus on is the first 20 years of the 20th century. And a number of important events occurred during that time that really still affect us today. So there were a couple of major wildfires. The Peshtigo fire, Peshtigo, Minnesota. At that time, and up until 9/11, the largest single loss of life in a catastrophic event in the US. The Cloquet fire, Cloquet, Wisconsin, similar. But in 1905, President Theodore Roosevelt established the U.S. Forest Service. And the Forest Service was designated as the lead federal agency for coordinating wildland firefighting efforts. The Forest Service primary function, in addition to being stewards of the public trust, et cetera, was the commercial development of timber. Timber at that point was more so than today was viewed as a natural resource, just like coal or anything else, since 90% of the building was done with timber. So in all of this, the thread is fire is the enemy. Fire must be conquered, it must be fought at every turn, and it is the enemy of mankind. Even, not just in Western, our local town of Hopewell, if you know where Hopewell is, out where the James and the Appomattox rivers come together, destroyed in 1915 by fire. So the Forest Service policy, as the lead agency, was formed in those early years of the 20th century, and that was fire is the enemy. And the policy was what they called the 10 o'clock rule. And that was that by 10 o'clock the next morning, any fire that was discovered was expected to be contained, controlled, and ideally extinguished. So that's all well and good, except one major problem, and that is that fire is a beneficial and a necessary part of wildland ecology. And I say it's a necessary part. The example that we use is the most common kind of pine tree in the West is two types, lodgepole pine and ponderosa pine. And those trees reproduce through pine cones. And a pine cone is a flower, essentially, and the segments of the pine cone are like the petals on the flower. Well, those trees, that pine cone, the central core of the pine cone that holds them together is pine pitch and resin and stuff, and it has to be heated to 350 or 400 degrees to release those seeds. So fire plays a very necessary part in the ecology. Professor Villegas, very interesting guy. And I got to hear him once at UC Davis. He's a wildland fire scientist. And what he said, and this stuck with me, was every acre west of the Rockies, without human intervention, should have burned at least 3 times in the last 100 years. So the problem is that we've been interrupting that natural process by not allowing that beneficial regenerating fire to occur. So the Indians, 500 years before Columbus, the Indians knew about this. And this is a pretty famous Frederick Remington painting that's in the Remington Museum in upstate New York. It's called The Grass Fire. But the Indians understood that if they burned off last year's corn crops and so on, next year's growth would be more robust and more bountiful. So a relative, and I say relatively low temperature ground fire, 500 degrees or so, has a number of positive effects. And first of all, the trees are not harmed by it. They're helped because it clears out all the stuff that's competing for water and resources. But more important, that low temperature heat brings nitrogen to the surface of the soil. Don't ask me how that happens. It's some mysterious chemical process. Indians didn't have a word for nitrogen, but they understood this. So when I say low temperature fire, there's fire and then there's fire. So this looks pretty dire, but if you notice, it's moving horizontally. The tree in the foreground is not harmed. And when this fire moves through, 2 or 3 good rainfalls, and this will all green up again and regenerate. Now, the opposite of that is if you have a large buildup of fuels, in other words, fallen trees, leaves, pine needles, all those things that the low temperature fire was not able to clear out in a timely way, you end up with a much hotter fire that is vertical rather than horizontal. It gets into the upper canopy of the trees, and it's referred to as a crown fire. Crown fire is a catastrophic event for the forest, and it burns if that horizontal fire burns at 400 or 500 degrees. Crown fire generally is around 1,500 degrees. And instead of regenerating soil, it sterilizes the soil down to about 1.5 feet, and all the beneficial critters, bacteria and so on, that would help in regenerating the forest are killed. So obviously, crown fire is something that you want to avoid at all costs. So a century of very aggressive firefighting has resulted in large, as you would assume, large buildup of fuels on the ground. So ground fires have become more common, and what the Forest Service refers to as the Smoky Bear effect. That is, only you can prevent wildfires. Fire is the enemy. So the Forest Service in late 60s, I guess, adopted a policy of what they call controlled burns. And they would take a part of national forest or national park, federally controlled lands, and essentially preempt the natural process by setting fire to it and causing that low temperature ground fire to clear out the buildup of fuels. And did anybody here ever work for the Forest Service? No? Okay, good. Typical of the Forest Service, they call them controlled burns. Well, so many of them got out of control that they said we have a public relations problem here. So from now on, we're going to call it prescribed burns. And the Yellowstone fire of 1988, if you remember that, at the time was the largest recorded wildfire in history. Started out as a Forest Service prescribed burn. So they decided we're not going to call it prescribed burn anymore because we didn't prescribe this. So managed fire is now the terminology. But even with the policy of managed fire, whatever you want to call it, they're still working against 100 years of well-intentioned mismanagement, and that the money that is appropriated each year for fuels reduction is never sufficient to address even a small percentage of the problem. So don't try to understand this. Let me explain it to you. The columns are the numbers of wildfires each year. And this goes back to, I think, 1980 something. The jagged line is the amount of acreage burned. So you can see the number of fires is really pretty consistent. We're not having more fire than we used to. But if you look at the amount of territory burned, there's a very definite line from lower left to upper right. So fires are hotter, larger, more destructive. So, now when you say climate change, I know that's a red flag for some people. And I think, we could have a reasonable discussion about what causes climate change, whether, on the one hand, you can believe it's all a natural process, sunspots, whatever, natural cycles. On the other hand, you can believe that it's entirely caused by industrial activity, humans, carbon dioxide, or somewhere in between. Well, while we can maybe argue about the cause, I don't think anyone at this point can argue about the fact that it's occurring. So, warmer temperatures, drier, drought, all putting stress on the wildlands, on the forests, and what we used to talk about fire seasons. And a fire season was from late spring to about Thanksgiving. Now we talk about fire years, because fires occur literally year-round now. And if you remember the Palisades fire and the Eaton fire in California, almost exactly 1 year ago, now in January. So the 10 years, the 10 years with the most acreage burned have all occurred since 2000. So where are we today? Federal firefighting, coordinated by the Forest Service as the lead agency, but I say it's always been dysfunctional. And part of the reason for that is that stakeholders in the firefighting process and the budgeting process and the allocation of funds are 2 different departments, 5 different agencies. 5 agencies: Forest Service, Park Service, the Bureau of Land Management, the Bureau of Indian Affairs, Fish and Wildlife. So I submit to you that Fish and Wildlife has a different set of priorities when it comes to wildfire management than the Bureau of Indian Affairs, just like the Park Service has a different set of priorities from the Bureau of Land Management. So competing priorities, chronically underfunded, and I'll talk about why that is a little bit. Congress appropriates money for firefighting into basically 2 different buckets. One is suppression, and that's obvious, that's guys with hoses and so on, and fuel reduction. So ideally, if you spend enough resources at it, you can preempt some of these very serious fires from occurring by thinning the forest, cleaning up the forest floor so you don't get that crown fire, destructive crown fire. Well, the Forest Service for a long time made their budget request based on a 10-year average. So in other words, they go back 10 years, say this is how much money we have asked for each of those years. Now we'll take an average and say that's what our budget request is going to be. And I have to admit, I admire the integrity of that process, because they had an intellectual basis for what they were asking. However, going with a 10-year average, you saw that graph. Right away, you are not asking for enough money, because 10 years ago, the fires weren't as bad. So, and I say, I'm sure enough of you have had experience with the federal budgeting process. You know how it works. As an agency, if you need $1 million when you ask for 3, you know you're going to get whittled down. The Forest Service would go in and say, this is how much money we need, and it really was how much they needed, and of course that got decremented. So there was never enough money, but they compensated for that by what they call fire borrowing. So when the money for suppression would run out, we take it from the reduction effort, so hurting yourself in a number of ways. And when that money ran out, as it always would every year, they would then cancel any construction contracts, do a stop work, shift that money to fire suppression. Well, it's a quick source of funds, but by doing a stop work, say on a National Forest headquarters building, now when you go back 6 months from now and want to restart that, it's going to cost you twice as much as it would have if you just let it go. So fire borrowing, a practical solution to a problem, but a very self-defeating one in the process. California is the only state that has its own ground and air firefighting capability. There's an agency called CAL FIRE, and they have a large number of employees, vehicles, and their own Air Force. But CAL FIRE, again, you can imagine their remit is the protection of lives and property. They're not interested in letting things burn. So, again, all these competing priorities. And for any number of economic and cultural reasons, people are building farther and farther out. They're farther out from where they work, farther into the wildlands. It isn't a case of nature encroaching upon human activity, it's the other way around. So, you know, I think we all get it. People like to live where the air is clean and your kid has a lower chance of getting shot on the way home from school. So in a typical fire, I just told you there is no such thing as a typical fire season. But if there were, it would work something like this. The first fires start in the southeast US, then the action shifts toward the high desert in Arizona until the southwest monsoon starts. And then up into the Great Basin in the Pacific Northwest. And the fire season generally ends in Southern California with the Santa Ana wind phenomenon. So, Southern California, without talking about Santa Ana, and I'm sure some of you have lived in California before, and you understand that. That's it's a regularly occurring annual phenomenon. And the deal is that over the Great Basin area, there's generally a high pressure area. Off the Pacific coast, low pressure forms. Air flows from high pressure to low pressure, and the speed of that is dependent on the differential. But what happens is that the air, which is fairly dry to begin with, is forced through the canyons and the mountain passes as it approaches the coast. And when you compress air, one of the byproducts of that is heat. You remember when you were a kid, you were pumping up your bicycle, how the barrel of the pump got hot? Well, that's because of compression. So as the air moves toward the coast, it becomes hotter, which means that whatever moisture it had gets evaporated out. And those two Italian guys you met in high school physics, Venturi and Bernoulli, as the air is pushed through the mountain passes, the pressure drops and the speed increases. So by the time that air gets to the coast, it's hot, it's very dry, and it's moving really fast. 60 miles an hour, 80 miles an hour, not uncommon, 100 miles an hour, not unheard of. So, iconic Southern California, palm trees. And if you notice with the royal palm, and it's estimated that there are 500,000 royal palm trees in LA County alone. But if you notice that, unlike eastern hardwood tree, which as the tree goes up, the trunk gets bigger, with the royal palm, the trunk doesn't increase in circumference. So the palm tree has a kind of unique way of getting water all the way up to the foliage there on the top. And then in the central part of that very thin trunk it's like a tube that's filled with water. So when a palm tree burns, that water there turns to steam and the tree literally blows its top. So if you can imagine this being pushed up into 60, 80 mile an hour winds, everywhere one of those embers lands, it's like a blowtorch. So We lived in California for over 20 years, and at that time lived in 5 different houses. Every one of those houses had a cedar-shaped roof. Nice to look at, but when hit with this, they don't last very long. So the other thing that was going on in that first 20 years of the 20th century, Wright brothers, Kitty Hawk, and the famous picture of Orville and Wilbur. And for the next 20 years or so, it's kind of what I call the clown car period of aviation development and firefighting. They were actually an attempt to drop beer barrels filled with water on fire. What could possibly go wrong? Especially you wanted to be the guy on the fire line with somebody dropping. So, pretty amazing to me when you stop and think about it. Pearl Harbor was 38 years after that picture of Orville and Wilbur. The amount of development that took place, aviation development, is to me just incredible. And you went from fabric and balsa wood to aluminum, the metallurgy, the aluminum structure, rigid fuselage, flush rivets, and mainly the engines that propelled that. So, in context, 38 years for that incredible development. If we go back 38 years from today, Ronald Reagan was in the middle of his second term and had just given that speech at the Brandenburg Gate in Berlin. Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. I remember that pretty well. 38 years is not a very long period of time. But World War II was kind of a watershed for the aero firefighting industry. As we came out of that with a lot of young men who've been trained to fly large airplanes close to the ground and drop stuff from airplanes on targets on the ground. And there were large numbers of surplus aircraft at the end of the war. And there were 5 founding companies of in the aerial firefighting business. And they were all founded by young men who come through that experience, mostly B-17 pilots from 8th Air Force in Europe. First, I'd say serious attempt at firefighting was from an airplane was in 1955. But there's no real incentive to develop aircraft because there were literally thousands of them sitting in the desert. This is the aerial view of Davis Month and the Air Force Base, which is where the military parks its surplus aircraft. High desert, it's outside of Tucson, Arizona. In the years leading up to World War II and during war, we built 12,000 B-17s. In the 1950s, there were 3,000 of them there at Davis Monthan. The other side of that story is we lost 5,000 B-17s over Europe, which B-17 had a crew of about 12 or 14. If you do 5,000 times 12 or 14, it's an incredible number. That could be the subject of a whole separate talk. But all these aircraft sitting there basically for the taking. And all you had to do at that point was show up at the gate saying, I'd like a B-17. So, if you could show that you were incorporated, in other words, you were a bona fide business, reel one out, and you can take it home. So aircraft that are in Davis Monthan, they're in a couple different categories. The first is called War Reserve, and these are aircraft that have been retired with lots of life left. Maybe the systems in them have become obsolete, but they essentially, as the name implies, could be rolled out and go off to war with very minimal preparation. The second category is foreign military sales. You know, these are aircraft that have become more obsolete, but we'll sell them to our friends. And then the last category is disposal. In other words, airplanes that are functionally scrap metal and will be crunched up and sold that way. So, early days of the industry, say cowboys and crop dusters, and people who were mostly young men who were, like I said, used to flying low and hitting specific targets. And the early industry attracted a certain personality type. And I would say they did not fit well in a hierarchical, regimented circumstance. There were a lot of free spirits, and this guy in the picture is a pretty famous guy. He actually made the transition from that period of time to the modern aircraft. But if you notice, he's wearing some baggy cargo shorts. You can't see it, but he has flip-flops on. He normally was wearing a really loud Hawaiian shirt. His name was Bill Waldman. And I don't have time to tell you any Bill Waldman stories, but you stick around. But the attitude of most of the pilots in the system was, I know how to do this. I don't need to use that checklist. I got it. We have a performance manual for the airplane, but somebody spilled coffee on it, so. So, generally, the Forest Service has gotten what it wants, but on the cheap. In other words, they haven't paid for it. They've gotten the industry to pay for the certification and the conversion of commercial aircraft or ex-military aircraft into the firefighting role, and 100% of the risk is borne by the industry. I don't think there's any other business model for federal contractors where that amount of development has to take place that the government doesn't subsidize it in some way. But the Forest Service has gotten away, but they still do. They're still getting away with it, of putting that burden on the industry. And I talked about the Forest Service, their budget process always lacking sufficient funding, but Forest Service contracting policies contributed to kind of the dark ages of the industry. And I say that because contracts were awarded based on the acronym was LPTA, lowest price technically acceptable. In other words, lowest bidder got the contract. So that led to a proliferation of mom and pop companies with maybe one or two airplanes, and they could underbid everybody by not doing proper maintenance. You know, aircraft maintenance is in two types. There's unscheduled maintenance, stuff breaks, you need to fix it. Unscheduled maintenance is done on an hourly or cycles or calendar basis. And in some cases, you know, we know pretty much where the fatigue points are on an airplane. And you need to disassemble the airplane enough to inspect a specific part. Well, that inspection might take you an hour, but it took you 500 hours to get to that part, if you understand the idea. So these small companies were saying, well, okay, I've got to inspect the wing spar on this airplane this year. Maybe I'll just put it off till next year. And we were losing 1 or 2 or 3 aircraft and crews per season, largely to structural fire accidents. So where, you might ask, was the FAA? And the answer is nowhere. Okay, to be fair, the FAA was established in 1958. So the industry had about a 15-year head start on all this bad activity. But the FAA took a look at what the Forest Service was basically subsidizing with contracts in the late 60s. And frankly, they were appalled. He said, you're doing what? You're taking these airplanes and you're converting them to a purpose that they were not designed to do, they were not tested, and you have no idea what the fatigue life, how the fatigue life of these aircraft is affected by what you're doing with them. So the first reaction was shut the whole thing down. Well, at that point, the industry had been around long enough that it was a pretty good political following. And from a congressman's standpoint, when your district is burning, airplane flies overhead dropping red stuff, that's me looking out for you folks here on the ground. So the last thing that the FAA, as a fairly new agency at that point, wanted to do was to die on that hill. So what they said was, okay, the Department of Defense, the FAA does not play at all in the development of a military airplane. That's entirely done by the Department of Defense. And the Department of Defense has thousands, literally thousands, of structural engineers, aero engineers, mechanical engineers, electrical engineers, who develop a test and certification program that in a lot of ways is more stringent than anything that the commercial aircraft went through. So the FAA says to the Secretary of Defense, you are the airworthiness authority for any military airplane. Well, that's essentially what they did with the Forest Service. They said to the Director of the Forest Service, you are the airworthiness authority for this industry that is going on. And how many aero engineers did they have the Forest Service have? So the chief of the Forest Service at that time said, well, clearly we can't do this, but what we'll do is contract that function out to the people who are operating the aircraft. So obviously they have a financial interest in making sure that everything's done properly. So we'll just let them do their own thing and we'll hope for the best. So about this time, video was becoming more, probably not quite in handheld phones yet, but you remember those VHS cameras and so on? So there were some pretty spectacular accidents that occurred, literally wings coming off airplanes, but they occurred with somebody filming them. So they got a lot of publicity. So the Forest Service at this point, as a result of some lawsuits that kind of prodded them into it, but they said, eventually, probably sooner rather than later, one of these morons is going to drop an airplane on a hospital or an elementary school or an orphanage, and we are going to have a lot to answer for. So we need to get ahead of this problem. We're not going to get ahead of it, but at least try to catch up with it. So what the Forest Service did was they facilitated the transfer of more modern, high-performance aircraft to the industry. Forest Service said, well, first of all, we got to get rid of all those mom and pops. That's easy. We just don't contract with them, and they'll kind of went out of business. But to get fairly modern, high-performance aircraft into the hands of the industry, they facilitated the 5 companies that they considered to be financially viable, facilitated them going to the desert and literally taking airplanes out, didn't pay them any money to convert them or to certify them, but at least they said we're not standardizing, but we're getting rid of the cats and dogs, and this looks like a more professional operation. From the industry standpoint, free airplane, but it's gonna cost a couple of $1 million to do the engineering and the conversion work. So the industry, the type aircraft that was made available to the industry was the C-130, which is a very common cargo airplane, and the P-3. So the industry, by and large, said, if we're gonna pay a couple $1 million to do the engineering and the conversion work, we're not gonna turn it over to our current stable of cowboy pilots. We want to professionalize this process because we've got a lot invested in this now. So what they did basically was hired ex-Air Force and ex-Navy people to run their maintenance program, to do their pilot training, and in most cases, to become their pilots. So early 90s, the gentleman who was the president of Aero Union Corporation in Chico, California, said, got the other 4 presidents of the companies together, and he said, Dale Newton was his name, he's quite a guy. He said, we have allowed the Forest Service to divide and conquer, and we are fighting with each other, where we really ought to be fighting with the Forest Service. And what we need to do, we have a really good story to tell, but we're not sure who to tell it to. So what we need to do is hire somebody who understands the congressional appropriations process, who can tell our story to the right people, and we'll bypass the Forest Service and get the funding that we need in spite of the Forest Service. He said, so where are we going to find a person who has preferably a pilot, preferably a C-130 or a P-3 pilot, someone who has can speak with credibility to Congress and to staffers, can be our liaison with the FAA on regulatory and technical issues, and can have some credibility with the Navy. Dale Newton took the P-3 aircraft, and can borrow a hydraulic pump or a flatback shredder if we need one. Where are we going to find somebody like that? Well, it turns out it was me. So that is where the trajectory of my life and the glide slope of the aerial firefighting industry intersect. And I became essentially the lobbyist for the industry, and worked the Congress on funding issues and so on for the next 25 years. So how does all this fit together? We talked about fire policy, we talked about aircraft. Now, how does this apply to a fire in the wildland? So first of all, a campaign fire, a long-term fire, is a war. Hand crews, seasonal employees, no benefits, 24-hour shifts. It's a very tough proposition. And like I said, it's a war. It's hard, it's dirty, it's dangerous. That's a woman, by the way. There are a lot of women who work the fire line. Hard, dangerous, dirty, underpaid, and we're learning more and more that smoke is really a hazardous environment. And particularly when you have a fire like the Palisades fire or the Eaton fire, where there's a lot of urban involvement. You have all kinds of, it isn't just wood smoke we're talking about now. There's everything else, every dangerous chemical that goes into a house is in that smoke. So the ground element of this, the idea, the strategy is get ahead of the fire and build breaks. And you can take advantage of natural things like rivers, or unnatural things like 12-lane wide freeways, or you create a fire break by knocking down trees and so on. I gotta spend a moment to talk about fire retardant, the red stuff. Always kind of the orphan of the chemical industry, but was acquired by a company from Monsanto called ICI, Israeli Chemical Industries. And they turned it into a real product. Fire retardant is ammonium phosphate, it's fertilizer. And it costs about $4 per gallon, weighs about 10 pounds a gallon. So it's the red is dye marker specifically so you can see where it went on the ground and where it stopped. So fire retardant laid ahead of the fire with the idea of channeling the fire or essentially stopping the spread. Not without some controversy. Fire retardant is not allowed in the EU. In the EU, they drop water exclusively. So, my piece of the industry was in the large air tanker market. And the whole idea behind large air tankers was initial attack. And the idea is if you can get on a fire quickly in the first hours of that fire and get retardant out in front of it, you can cause the fire to essentially burn out if you lay the retardant such that the fire doesn't jump in. So in a typical scenario, fires reported, the National Interagency Fire Center in Boise, Idaho, will dispatch a large air tanker and what they call an air attack supervisor. It's that light twin airplane that has an experienced firefighter who kind of takes charge of the situation and directs the tanker on where to drop the retardant. Fires have a growth cycle, and if you can get the fire within about the first third of that slope on the left-hand side, you've got a good chance of containing. And retardant rather than water. Water is put directly on the fire to extinguish it. Retardant is laid ahead of the fire to channel it away from structures, to slow the progress, and in the worst case, to create a escape route for firefighters. So water works pretty well and deployed almost exclusively by helicopter. Okay, typical initial attack, got a fire, got wind from the northeast. The NIFC, the fire center, will deploy one tanker and a lead plane. Tanker will lay a line of retardant at about a 45-degree angle to the predicted path of the fire on both sides. And the idea is to channel the fire into that chevron of retardant, and if the wind cooperates and the retardant is path on the ground is thick enough, the fire will burn out. Important terms. You hear fire is 95% contained. Great. Well, what does that mean? Containment is a technical definition. And what it means is that when the fire is 100% contained, it means that there's a barrier around the fire, that the fire has a 0 probability of crossing. So you can have a situation where I've got fire breaks and retardant 10 miles ahead of the fire. The fire is technically contained, but everything that's between here and that 10 miles is at risk. So containment is not really that useful a statistic. Control, ultimately the byproduct that you want of containment is control. And that is essentially extinguishing the fire. So that strategy with the tankers works if you've got a large network of bases and you can get a tanker onto a fire within 15 or 20 minutes. And this is the Northern Rockies, essentially the combat radius of the bases. Incident management of the fire. Fire, when you have a failure of initial attack, it then becomes a sustained attack proposition. It's very similar, command structure is very similar to military in that you've got a commander, ground troops, troops in contact with the enemy, air support, logistics, and so on. The feds fight fire on federal land. Half the land west of the Rockies is federal land. This is, I think, one of those pictures that tells a story. And this is in the San Gabriel Mountains, just northeast of LA. If you go over that one peak there, about 75 miles later, you'll be at the Bellagio. Okay. Typical California landscape, scrubby stuff, not tall trees, generically known as chaparral, 30 different types of laurel, manzanita, mesquite, all kinds of things. Burns really well. Along the mountains, there are these fire trails that have been cut specifically to get equipment, men, but also to be the foundation of a fire break. And you can see over this area, the fire has come up to this point. The incident commander said, this road here, this ridge line is where I will make my stand, essentially. Retardant then added to the fire breaks, and it looks like it was successful. The fire has not gone down this road. You can see the same thing. This is, I guess, what you call it. Oops. Okay, the good part. So, and I realize I'm running out of time, so I'm going to step through this really fast. The U.S. government does not own any tanker aircraft. They contract. And contracts are for 90 or 120 days. And the ideal retardant drop, first of all the aircraft now in the business are next generation commercial aircraft. B-87 and 747. This is the certification drop. B-87. 5,000 pounds of retardant. That's why I didn't. But the ideal retardant drop, 150 feet above the ground, 135 knots. If you're higher, the retardant is too dissipated. If you're lower, it's too concentrated. This is what 150 feet above the terrain looks like. People see this picture and they think it's an accident. As that guy, Bill Waldman, lining up to drop on a downward slope canyon. Okay, several types of tankers differentiated by capacity. Very large air tankers, essentially DC-10s now, have a pretty good capacity. You can see in this frame, the incident commander has chosen a piece of freeway as his defensible line, and the tanker is dropping retardant on one side of the freeway there. So very large air tankers. This is the one that always has people interested, is the 747. And it's kind of a monster, but 20,000 gallons of retardant. But 747 has been retired. It's not any longer in active service. And part of the reason for that is, I told you 150 feet above the ground. Well, that's less than one wingspan of 747. You gotta be a pretty courageous guy to be flying through mountain passes and everything. You get one wingspan. 135 knots, that's 30 knots below stall speed on the 747. So, I told you too that's retardant is about $4 a gallon. So the daily rate on that 747 was a little over $100,000 a day. The hourly rate is about $25,000. And I'm a couple of years out of date, but 20,000 gallons of retardant. What you just saw there is about $200,000 worth of firefighting. So clearly, not many jurisdictions can afford that kind of cost. Water scoopers, they have a role, and they're used extensively in Europe and in northern tier states, Minnesota, Quebec, places with a lot of lakes and so on. Not so much in the lower US because you need a mile and a half or two of straightaway. You know, I'm an airplane guy, and most of the time when you look at an airplane, to me, it just looks like it should be flying. I look at that CO450, and to me, it looks like a couple of single-engine airplanes flying wing on a dumpster. 6 to 10 seconds to scoop up a load. And in this case, this is, I think, Shasta Lake, Northern California. But like I said, effective, but for very specific use. Like I said, not a graceful airplane. But again, very useful in specific circumstances. Helicopters. Now, I'll defer to my friend Holmes here about helicopters. I don't like to talk about them because going on 60 years in the business, I still don't understand why they fly. The standard fixed wing guy view of helicopter is it's a million parts rotating rapidly around an oil leak. Leading to another fatigue. So the Forest Service has hundreds of helicopters on call and on contract. And again, you can see retardant fires pass through. Retardant is perhaps doing its job, and the helicopter is going to do a mop-up, hitting hot spots. This is the business end of a helicopter called a Bambi bucket. A lot of people think somehow Bambi got scooped up. I don't think that happened. But a couple hundred gallons of water are pretty effective. And the last thing I want to show you, this is a Sikorsky air crane, and he's about to drop 1,800 gallons of water on from pretty much a hover. So visualize one, if this was retardant, a lot more dense and heavier, and moving at 150 miles an hour. And you can see what happens on the ground here.
Whoa.
Not hard to collapse a house or kill people if it's deployed in the wrong place. So, I'm over time. But,
It's just you now.
I'm happy to entertain any questions or comments you might have.
Yeah, I've had a lot of experience with Western fires. We quantified a lot of the habitat. If you take like ponderosa pine, blue bunch, wheatgrass, those are pine tree grassland, and lots of low-key fires. So we've come in, grazed, stopped the fire, we have young trees, more shrubs, and now it crowns.
Yeah.
And a lot of these areas, I kind of wonder, they burn traditionally. Fires went from frequent.
Well, yeah, like
And air tankers miss a lot from
fires
fire.
is a naturally occurring thing. And the problem, though, is that there's never enough funding to complete the program at the level that it would be, large scale effective.
When you were talking about that relatively stable number of fires versus the amount of acreage burned, is that because of people infringing on wooded lands, or is it because there are fires like the ones last year in California that are urban? Or is it mixed?
Probably a combination of all those things. The fires like the Palisades Fire, and Eaton Fire, and Santa Rosa, Paradise, California. A large part of the problem with those is that nobody's equipped to deal with them. It's not strictly an urban fire anymore. Urban structural firefighter will roll up to a house fire or a building. Well, in this case, they're rolling up to 100 house fires. They don't have the people or the equipment they need to deal with that. 100 fires burning, moving at 60 miles an hour. And it's not a wildland fire thing. You're not going to go build a fire break through somebody's neighborhood. So it's sort of a hybrid situation that nobody is really equipped to deal with properly, but is becoming more and more common.
I got a question for you about the,
Okay, let tells me one more question.
I got a question about the logistics on putting together the teams. You showed that mosaic with all those airfields. And my question is, do you have ground support equipment at each one of those airfields? Or do they have to fly in the ground support equipment as they fly in the aircraft?
The latter, that in those tanker bases, there's a retardant mixing capability, but any unscheduled maintenance that's required on the airplane. Generally, when a tanker tanker deploys to a tanker base, they'll carry a mechanic in the back as a passenger. So he's there, but obviously limited to what he can do if there's a problem that requires specific equipment. So the answer to your question is very basic logistics, maintenance, supply. You have to fly stuff in.
Al's gonna be around to take additional questions if you want to come up. That'd be great. Alicia, what comes next?
Coffee, tea, cookies, right out here. So please, and Al is gonna stay around, so please